This is Professor Stephen Litch in the Principles of Economics, and this lecture is on monopoly. Monopoly, the type of market, not the game. A monopoly is a market with a single seller of a unique good or service. In reality, there are probably no markets that are absolutely perfect examples of monopolies, but Microsoft, for example, has a near monopoly on selling office software like word processing software and spreadsheet software. Microsoft Office and Microsoft Excel are products that almost everyone uses, and there's really no competition. Now, a monopoly is almost the furthest possible type of market from a competitive market. Remember, a competitive market has many sellers of identical goods. And I think of, for example, milk as a competitive market. Every farmer, every dairy farmer who sells milk has to essentially accept the price that's being offered by the buyers, the milk distributing companies. No farmer would be able to insist on being paid a higher price than other farms. And at the same time, no farmer would ever see a reason to offer to sell milk at a lower cost. So they just take the price that's being offered in the market and they sell whatever they have at that price. A monopolist, again, is the opposite extreme from a competitive firm. The monopolist gets to set the price and also determines the quantity they'll sell. Really, those two decisions are the same. If they restrict the amount they sell, it'll drive up the price, or they can think of their decision as setting a high price, which will automatically limit the amount that people will want to buy. But the monopolist does set its own price or control its own price. A final important characteristic of a monopoly market is there's no free entry. In other words, additional firms are not able to easily enter the market. There may be various reasons for that. Different circumstances can lead to a monopoly in some market. There could be concentrated ownership of resources. In other words, a single firm owns all of the resource in the beginning. The best example from United States history would be the Standard Oil Company, which was created by or best associated with John Rockefeller in the late 1800s and early 1900s. At its peak, the Standard Oil Company controlled about 90% of the oil production, petroleum production in the United States. That's almost as close as it can possibly get to a single firm controlling the entire market. Another good example would be the De Beers Corporation, the De Beers Company, which for 150 years has been the world's largest producer of diamonds. And at its peak, De Beers produced about 80% of the diamonds in the world. De Beers is really interesting because diamonds are, in fact, not a particularly rare resource. They're gemstones, they are uncommon, but the one thing that makes them different from other gemstones like rubies or aquamarines is that the diamonds are concentrated in only a few mines in the world, and those mines are all under the ownership, or mostly under the ownership, of a single corporation, De Beers. And De Beers very tightly controls the supply of diamonds to the world in order to maintain a very high price. So maybe this is something you should keep in mind if you're ever shopping for a diamond. The scarcity and value of diamonds is very artificial. They are scarce and valuable only because one company is controlling the supply and trying to maintain a high price. On top of that, De Beers advertises heavily. Everything that you might know about a diamond might come out of a De Beers marketing campaign. De Beers has invented the idea of a diamond engagement ring, a diamond solitaire ring. De Beers has come up with marketing slogans like "Diamonds are a girl's best friend," "Diamonds are forever." When you go into the jewelry store and you try to purchase a diamond, you're told about the four C's of a diamond: the cut, the carats, the clarity, the color. All of these are things that De Beers has stressed in order to, well, for various reasons, but really to maintain the value of their own uh, diamonds that they sell. Monopolies can also be created by government restrictions or some similar type of restriction. Patents and copyrights are a good example of a government restriction. Both of those are for intellectual property, would be the term. A patent allows a person who invents something to be the sole producer of that for a certain period of time, often 14 years. So that's someone who invents a new machine, device, or a company that invents a new medication is allowed to be the sole producer for a period of time. A copyright protects things like books and music and movies from being copied. And again, a copyright allows the original creator of that book, movie, song to be the sole producer of the song. And others may not produce these items that are patented or copyrighted. The idea behind a patent or a copyright is that they allow the inventor to receive higher payments, kind of in compensation for inventing or developing the item. With medications, it's extremely expensive for pharmaceutical companies to produce a new medication, sometimes costing billions of dollars for the research, the trials, like testing whether the medication works, whether it's safe, those trials, and then the marketing, distribution of the medication, along with a whole bunch of kind of false starts, attempts at developing a medication that lead nowhere. So the cost of developing a new drug can run into the billions of dollars. The company that does all that investment wants some type of reassurance that it's going to be able to make money to recover its investment. And so a patent allows that protection. If any other company could enter the market immediately and start producing the drug as soon as it's approved, then no one would ever do the research and do the testing to ensure that the drug works and is safe. That would be essentially like a public good, and the other companies would want to free ride off of whoever does that work. So, again, the patent system allows protections so that a company can get profits in the short run from a new invention. Copyrights, movies are in some ways similar to the medical drugs. They're expensive to produce, but once all the work has been done of paying the actors, building the sets, filming things, editing, distributing, once all of that's done, it's very easy to duplicate the movie. And the the theater company or the movie production company needs to be able to sell or be the exclusive seller of the movie for a period of time. And with movies, it's often 75 years, I believe. But for a period of time, only that, that, movie production company can sell it. If, on the contrary, there were no copyrights, then the movie would get released. One person would get a copy, duplicate it, distribute it to everyone else for next to nothing, and there'd be no profits to the movie companies. And so they would have invested all the money into producing the movie, they'd make no revenue off of it, and that just isn't sustainable. So, in some ways, the copyright system is neat because it encourages innovation, but it is a monopoly. Okay, other examples of government created monopolies might be in the medical profession. In order to be a doctor, a person needs to graduate from medical school and then pass the medical exam. So not anyone is allowed to practice medicine. A person must be licensed. And so that is a form of a restriction. In other words, the American Medical Association is the sole seller of licensed doctors. Similarly, the American Bar Association approves lawyers, and so it is essentially the single seller of lawyers. Dentists are controlled. Even in North Carolina, at least, hairdressers must be licensed. And so, in some ways, the hairdressers' commission or the cosmetologists' commission is a monopoly seller of hairdressers in the state. I bring these professions up and these licensing requirements up because they are kind of interesting. But the justification for having them, at least according to like the American Medical Association, is that they ensure quality of doctors. That you know that when you go to a doctor, the doctor has adequate training and has the required knowledge. And maybe I can understand that for medicine and law, maybe even dentistry. Once it comes to cosmetology, hairdressers, I'm starting to think that's a bit of a stretch, that we need to have a system to ensure quality. Regardless, regardless, no matter what, these licensing requirements do restrict the supply into those professions. And whenever you restrict the supply, you drive up the cost. So all of these associations that are licensing people, licensing professionals in those fields, do have essentially monopoly power. And by restricting the supply, they drive up the cost. And this does, for certain, benefit the people in those organizations. The doctors who write the licensing exams do benefit from the higher salaries that doctors get because of scarce supply. Okay, another example I bring up is like concession stands. So this isn't quite a government restriction, but it might be that a movie theater or a sports arena has a restriction on who can sell concessions there. And so the concession stand in the movie theater is a monopoly seller of popcorn in the movie theater. And I'm sure you know exactly what a monopolist does in that case. They charge a ridiculously high price for a bucket of popcorn or a giant Coke just because they are the sole seller of that good. Next on my list, sometimes monopolies happen because there is a high fixed cost of a firm entering into the industry, and it's inefficient to have multiple firms competing. The best examples of these natural monopolies would be utility companies, like the electric company. It costs a lot of money to put down the infrastructure to get power to people's houses, essentially put up the utility poles and power lines to get electricity to people's houses. And It seems silly or inefficient to have two competing electric companies each put up their own infrastructure, their own set of utility poles and power lines to get electricity to houses. Generally, competition is good for consumers. It would be great if there were two companies that could compete to bring me electricity at the lowest cost, except if there were two companies both paying the fixed cost of entering into the profession or entering into the industry, the costs would have to be a lot higher. So the benefit of competition bringing down the price is not enough to offset the the inefficiency or high cost of having a second firm enter into the industry. So we call these natural monopolies. And again, utility companies are good examples. Toll roads are probably also a good example. If you think competition is usually good for consumers by driving down costs, then maybe there should be two toll roads connecting city A to city B, and they compete to provide the better service at the lower cost. Like, that's the idea of competition. But since toll roads are so expensive to build, the advantage of competition doesn't outweigh the extra cost of having two redundant roads running side by side. A final reason why monopolies arise are network effects. This is where the value of a good or service depends on the number of other users. Social media platforms would probably be a good example of network effects. The benefit you get from using Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or Google Plus was an old competitor to Facebook. LiveJournal was an old blogging website. MySpace was something else. Like, the benefit you get from using some social media platform depends on the number of other users. And since you would never want to be the first person to sign up for some new social media platform, you always want to go to one that already has lots of people. There's a natural tendency for people to concentrate in just a few platforms. So again, it's a network effect that the number of other users increases the value to you that causes people to come to use a single platform. Another example of network effects is with software. The more people your software is compatible with, the more valuable it is to you. So you might use Microsoft Word to edit documents, not because it's the best word processor on the market, but rather because it's so compatible with so many people. The same for Excel. Again, it might not be the best package for spreadsheets or handling data, but it's convenient to use because it is compatible with the most other people. Now I'd like to analyze a monopolist decision about how much to produce and how much to charge for its good. The amount that the monopolist will produce, I call that QM star, the quantity that maximizes profits for a monopolist. The M stands for monopolist, and PM star, the monopolist's optimal price, profit maximizing price. So this problem is going to begin with two things that the firm knows. One is demand for its good, and the other is the cost of production. So I imagine that this firm has done some marketing research and have determined at different prices how much people would purchase. So, for example, at a price of $13, 7 customers would purchase widgets. Another way of thinking of this is that the demand function tells us the price the monopolist can charge in order to sell some quantity. So if the monopolist wants to sell 12 widgets, it can charge a price of $8, and it will find 12 people who want to purchase widgets at $8. Okay? So again, if it wants to do something like sell 6 widgets, it can charge a price of $14. There are 6 people who would purchase widgets at $14 a piece. So that's a way of thinking about this demand function. The other thing that's given, I said, was a cost function. And for this example, I'm going to keep that cost function nice and simple. The cost of producing Q widgets is $10 as a fixed cost plus $5 for each widget produced. I'm going to work out this profit maximization problem 2 different ways. First, I'm going to do the long, tedious, difficult way. That means I'm going to calculate the profit that the company would get, the firm would get, from producing, for example, 9 widgets that it sells at $11 each, or the profit from selling 13 widgets at $7 a piece. So the long way is working out the profit for each level of quantity that the firm could produce. After doing this, then I'll do the shortcut way, which involves thinking at the margin. So first, let me do this with working out the profit from selling however many widgets. The first step is calculating the revenue if the company were to sell 5 widgets, 6 widgets, 7 widgets, and so forth. Selling 5 widgets, the monopolist could charge $15 a piece. So it can sell 5 widgets at $15 a piece for $75 of revenue. If it wants to sell 6 widgets, it could charge $14, giving it $84 of revenue. It could sell 7 widgets at $13 a piece for $91 of revenue, 8 widgets at $12 a piece for $96 of revenue, 9 widgets at $11 each for $99 of revenue, 10 widgets at $10 a piece for $100 of revenue. And then notice, actually, if it sells 11 widgets, the price needs to be $9, and it would receive $99 in revenue. So as a matter of fact, if this firm produces 11 widgets, it gets less revenue than if it produces 10 widgets. If it goes from 11 to 12 widgets, the revenue of the firm drops. It is getting less revenue even though it is selling more. It's making less money. That's because the monopolist has to keep cutting the price in order to find more customers. The monopolist could find 10 customers who are willing to pay $10, but to sell 11 widgets, it would have to drop the price to $9. So the revenue it gets from selling 11 widgets is in fact less than the revenue from selling 10. So let me just point out, the monopolist is never going to sell more than 10 widgets, or whatever maximizes revenue. The more widgets it sells, the higher the cost is. The more it produces, the higher the cost is. And once it goes beyond 10 widgets, it is making less revenue and it has higher costs. So for sure, there is no advantage to producing the 11th widget or the 12th widget. Again, producing a 12th widget, costs go up, yet the company is making less money. Okay, so this is kind of a funny thing for a monopolist, is that in order to sell more, it has to bring the price down. It can find, for example, 5 people who are willing to pay $15 for widgets, but if it wants to sell 16 widgets, it would have to bring the price down to $4. And so, in fact, selling 5 widgets at $15 a piece gives it more revenue, $75, than selling 16 widgets at $4 a piece, which would give it only $64 of revenue. This is the trade-off that the monopolist faces. Does it want to sell a small quantity at a high price or a large quantity at a low price? Of course, costs are also part of the decision for the monopolist or for any firm. Profits are the difference between revenue and costs. So it's not simply a matter of maximizing revenue, but rather profit, which is revenue minus cost. So this firm needs to work out the costs from producing 5, 6, 7, 8, and so forth widgets. And I gave a cost function for this firm. Total cost of production is $10 plus 5 times Q. A $10 fixed cost plus $5 for each unit it produces. That means that it can produce 5 widgets at a cost of $35. $10 plus 5 times 5 is 35. Can produce 6 widgets at a cost of 10 plus 5 times 6, so 10 plus 30 equals 40. Okay, and so on down the line here. In the next step, the firm calculates the profits it would get from selling 5 widgets, 6 widgets, and so forth. If it sells 5 widgets, it would get $75 in revenue, $35 in cost, giving it $40 of profit. If it sells 6 widgets, it can sell them at a cost of $14 a piece. The revenue is 6 times 14 equals 84. The cost of producing 6 is 40, and the profit is 44. Then 7 widgets can be sold for $13 a piece, yielding $71 of revenue. Cost of producing 7 is 45, and then finally $46 of profit. Producing 8 widgets would also yield $46 of profit. Producing 9 widgets, the profit would be $44. Producing 10 widgets, $40 of profit. Okay, if I were actually calculating this, I would stop at this point because profits will always increase up to a point and then start to decrease. Once the profits start to come down, they will continue to go down. So after I go from 46 to 44, I know that the profits are going down and I have passed the maximum. The maximum occurs right here at $46. So this firm can make $46 of profit, and it does that by producing 8 widgets, and it can sell 8 widgets at a cost of $12 a piece. So we've solved this problem for the monopolist. Given the demand function and the cost function, this monopolist would maximize profits by producing 8 widgets and selling them at $12 a piece. Okay, just a quick note. Whenever we're solving these problems and we encounter like a tie in profits, 2 different levels of output that will both maximize profits, The standard thing is we always go with the larger of the two. Though, honestly, if it came to a test or something, I would accept either one as correct. But just for simplicity, instead of always saying, well, 7 or 8 will maximize profits, producing 7 or 8 will maximize profits. Just for simplicity, we talk about the larger one. Now I want to work through this same problem the simpler way in terms of thinking at the margin. So the strategy here is that the firm keeps in mind that it's always profitable to produce something when the marginal revenue is greater than the marginal cost. And the firm should stop producing when marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The first step in doing this calculation is to come up with marginal revenue. The marginal revenue is the change in revenue when the firm produces this extra widget, or the additional revenue from selling this widget. When the firm goes from selling 5 widgets to selling 6 widgets, the firm's revenue increases from 75 to 84. So that increase of $9 is the marginal revenue. Again, the marginal revenue is the additional revenue from selling this extra unit, or it's the change in revenue from selling this unit. When the firm thinks of maximizing profits in terms of marginal revenue versus marginal cost, the other thing is to bring into the equation is that marginal cost, the additional cost of producing another widget. In this case, the total cost is $10 plus $5 for each unit produced. That means that each extra unit raises the cost by $5, so the marginal cost is $5. If the firm, for example, increases production from 10 widgets, which would cost $60, to 11 widgets, which would cost $65, the change in cost is 65 minus 60, $5. The marginal cost is always $5 for this firm. Let's calculate these marginal revenues now. When the firm's production increases from 5 widgets to 6 widgets, revenue increases from 75 to 84. So the marginal revenue is 84 minus 75 equals $9. Increasing production from 6 to 7 widgets, the revenue increases by $7. So the marginal revenue of the 7th widget is $7. When production increases from 7 to 8, revenue increases from 91 to 96. So the marginal revenue is $5. Increasing production from 8 to 9, revenue increases by $3 from 96 to 99. Again, it increases by $3, which means the marginal revenue is $3. Marginal revenue from the 10th widget is $1. Then 11th widget. Remember that when production goes from 10 to 11, revenue actually goes down. So the marginal revenue is negative $1. Similarly, when production goes from 11 to 12, revenue goes down from 99 to 96. So the marginal revenue is negative. By the way, I can just stop the table once I get into negative marginal revenue. There's no way the firm would be producing when the marginal revenue is negative. Again, that means that the firm is getting less revenue from selling more. if that seems contradictory, remember it's getting less revenue because it has to cut the price to find new customers. In order to sell more, it has to cut the price to find new customers. And that drop in the price is not enough to offset the fact that it's selling more. Anyhow, the monopolist will never sell quantity at a level where it's getting negative marginal revenue. Okay, but let's go back to this decision. The firm will maximize profits if it stops producing once it gets to the level where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The marginal cost for this firm is $5, so it should produce up to the point where the marginal revenue equals $5. That happens when it produces 8 widgets. So here we come to the conclusion that the profit maximizing quantity to produce is QM star equals 8. And what price should it charge? Well, the monopolist looks at the price column and it sees that it can find 8 customers who are willing to pay $12. So it would set the price at $12. And this is exactly the same conclusion that we came to when we worked out the full table and calculated the profit at each level of production. This method, thinking in terms of marginal revenue versus marginal cost, it's faster and it's also in some ways more logical. We can just break up the problem into thinking step by step. Is it beneficial to produce the 7th widget, the 8th widget, the 9th widget, and so forth? Let me emphasize the 2 important steps in maximizing profits for a monopolist. The quantity that maximizes profits is determined where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So again, the quantity, the output that would maximize profits for a monopolist is determined where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. The price is then determined by the demand curve or the demand function at this quantity. So remember, the demand function will tell us the price that people are willing to pay to purchase some quantity. So we look to the demand function to determine what price people would be willing to pay in order to purchase QM star. These 2 steps are very important to know. I want to add one final bit comparing the monopolist to a competitive market. So let's take the same demand function and the same cost function and think about the equilibrium in a competitive market. In a competitive market, a firm will always produce the quantity where price equals marginal cost. In this market, the marginal cost of producing a widget is always $5. Remember, the cost function is $10 plus $5 for each widget. So the marginal cost, the extra cost of another widget, is $5. If the marginal cost is $5, the price in the market will be $5. And when the price is $5, the firm will produce 15 widgets. So this competitive firm would do something very different from what the monopolist would do. The competitive firm would produce 15 widgets being sold for $5 a piece, whereas the monopolist would produce 8 widgets sold for $12 a piece. So the monopolist is substantially restricting supply in order to keep the price high. Okay, I've talked through this example. Next, I want to do the general graphical analysis for a monopoly market. So here it is, the standard model with price on one axis, quantity on the other. The firm starts with two things. One, it knows the demand for the product, and second, the marginal cost curve, which is based on its costs of production. Those two things, from the firm's perspective, are given. Like demand, that just has to do with market conditions. Marginal cost, that has to do with the technology available to the firm. Then the firm thinks about the marginal revenue from selling more widgets. I've added that marginal revenue curve into the picture. The marginal revenue curve lies below the demand curve. It is downward sloping, and it's approximately twice as steep as the demand curve. So it has those three important characteristics. Below the demand curve, downward sloping, approximately twice as steep as the demand curve. The reason that it's twice as steep as the demand curve has something to do with calculus. I'm not going to explain that, but I will point out that if you go back to my earlier example with the numbers, the demand curve had a slope of 1 to 1, while the marginal revenue curve had a slope of 2 to 1. So it is like that numerical example was exactly consistent with what I'm telling you right now, approximately twice as steep. Alrighty. Now, remember the first rule for how the monopolist determines the quantity it should produce. It should produce QM star, where the marginal revenue meets marginal costs. So that happens right here. Marginal revenue and marginal costs intersect. That determines the quantity QM star. To determine the price, the monopolist goes up from QM to the demand curve, and that tells us the price, PM star, that people would be willing to pay to purchase QM star. Okay, so that's the monopolist's quantity and price. Next, let me point out the area that represents consumer surplus. As always, it's the area above the price up to the demand curve as far out as the quantity sold. Okay, the consumer surplus is this triangle up here. Producer surplus is the area below the price down to the marginal cost curve. Let me make a note. Everywhere else, it's the area below the price down to the supply curve. And while for a competitive firm, the marginal cost curve and the supply curve are the same, for the monopolist, there's technically no supply curve. It's only a marginal cost curve. So it's almost the same definition as before. The area for consumer surplus is the area below the price, above the marginal cost curve, as far out as the quantity sold. Next, let's compare this monopolist to a competitive firm. So I'm going back to exactly the same picture with the market demand and the marginal cost of production at the firm. Now remember, for a competitive firm, the supply curve of a competitive firm is its marginal cost curve. To put that another way, a competitive firm always produces at marginal cost. In a competitive market, the market equilibrium would be determined where supply and demand intersect. So the equilibrium price would be PC star, and the quantity sold would be QC star. Here I'm showing the two different types of firms in the same graph so we can compare them more easily. The competitive firm chooses this point where marginal cost intersects demand. The monopolist chooses this point, which is right up from where marginal cost and marginal revenue intersect. If we compare these two firms, the output of the monopolist is lower than a competitive firm, right? QM star is less than QC star, and the monopolist charges a higher price, QM star. Okay, so this model is confirming the general intuition that a monopolist will want to charge a higher price in order to make more profit, though as a consequence, it will be able to sell less. The consequence of having a higher price is that the monopolist will be able to sell less output. Though, again, I'd like to mention that we can think of it the other way around, that maybe instead of setting a high price, the monopolist could restrict output. So instead of producing QC star as a competitive firm would have, the monopolist instead produces QM star. When the monopolist restricts output, then it forces the price up in the market. So the technical way that the monopolist achieves it could be by either raising the price or it could be by restricting quantity. But either way, the outcome is the same: a higher price and a lower quantity than a competitive firm. Now, I'd like to compare surplus between a competitive market and a monopoly. And this is an important topic because it gets at whether a monopoly is bad for consumers and whether it's profitable for the firm. So I hope the model for a competitive market is fairly familiar right now. Consumer surplus is the triangle above the price, below the demand curve, out to the equilibrium quantity. Producer surplus is above the supply curve, below the price, out to the equilibrium quantity. So here's the competitive market, and next I'm going to flip to the monopoly market. Consumer surplus, you should see that the consumer surplus area has gotten smaller. Instead of being the triangle above the competitive price, it's the triangle above the monopoly price. Smaller triangle means less consumer surplus. Consumers are hurt by a monopoly instead of a competitive market. Producer surplus has increased. Producer surplus was everything below, well, now it's everything below the price down to the supply curve, but as far out as QM. Okay. In the competitive market, it was everything below the competitive price, but as far out as the competitive equilibrium. It's not as easy to compare the areas directly just by eyeballing them, because in the monopoly, the monopolist gains a rectangle of surplus here and loses a triangle there. But I do promise, a monopolist has higher profits than a competitive firm would have. The logic is fairly simple. The monopolist could have chosen the same price and quantity as a competitive firm would have chosen, but instead the monopolist chooses a higher price and less output. If it chooses PM star and QM star over some other outcome, in particular over the competitive outcome, then it must be making more profit than it would be at that other outcome that it could have chosen. The final thing to note in this picture is deadweight loss. This triangle to the right of QM star out to where the competitive quantity would have been is deadweight loss. That is surplus that could have been generated but is not generated because the monopolist wants to keep the price high. In other words, all these people out here to the right of QM, they value a widget according to where they are on the demand curve. So this is someone's value of getting a widget. The marginal cost curve tells us what it would cost to produce that widget. And all in this area, this gray area, the value to a person is greater than the cost. So if those widgets were created, they would be worth more to someone than the cost of producing them. It's like imagine my movie theater is charging $10 for a bucket of popcorn when it really only costs them $3 to make it. I'm cheap, so I don't want to pay $10. And I honestly wouldn't pay $10 for a bucket of popcorn. So I go over to the concession stand and I say, listen, a bucket of popcorn is worth $6 to me. How about you sell me one for $5? You'll make some profit off of it. I'm paying you $5 for popcorn that really costs only $3 to make. And also, I'm better off. The popcorn brings me $6 of happiness, and I pay only $5. It's a win-win situation, right? And absolutely it is. And like the fact that it would be win-win, it would be beneficial for both parties, means there's surplus for both of us. But the fact is, the monopolist wouldn't do that because the monopolist must insist on keeping its price high. So we're losing out on those win-win situations. The monopolist couldn't credibly believe anyone who comes up and says, listen, I'm not willing to pay the full price. Will you cut me a deal? Like everyone's going to say that if they know they can negotiate a price with a monopolist. So the monopolist will have to stick with a higher price, and that creates this deadweight loss. It's inefficiency associated with a monopolist's high prices. Okay, let me go over some of the main points about a monopolist. First, the monopolist restricts quantity in order to keep prices high, or we could also think of that as the monopolist sets a high price knowing that it will sell less at that high price. Either way, it's the same thing. The monopolist sells a lower quantity at a higher price. This will increase the monopolist's profit, but it's important to know that there's this trade-off between the price and the quantity. When the monopolist raises its price, people purchase less of the good. And, how much people respond to the high price, that is determined by elasticity. Elasticity is a measure of how much people respond to an increase in the price. A couple of other important points about a monopolist. A monopoly will always reduce consumer surplus, and it will always create deadweight loss. Okay? Here's a list. I've tried to make it clear some of the main points about a monopoly market. Let me turn to this issue of elasticity. Remember, the monopolist wants to charge a higher price. That's how it increases its profits. There is this trade-off, though, that when the monopolist raises the price, people purchase less of the good. So raising the price to a point is good. It will increase profit if there's a small reduction in the quantity sold. But raising the price can also be counterproductive if there's a large reduction in the quantity sold. And basically what these two phrases are describing are inelastic demand, when there's a small reduction in the quantity sold, versus elastic demand, when there's a large reduction in quantity sold. So elasticity is important to the monopolist's strategy of setting the price high. The monopolist will be most successful with raising the price when demand is inelastic, and the monopolist will be fairly limited in its ability to raise the price if demand is elastic. So, a final thing that I should discuss relating to a monopoly is price discrimination. So, this is not necessarily the bad kind of discrimination. Discrimination simply means treating different people differently. In particular, charging different people different prices for the same good. This is something that can happen if a firm has the ability to set the price and if the firm knows that different groups have different elasticities of demand. So remember, that was the key thing that determined how much a monopolist could raise the price. If demand was fairly elastic, the monopolist could raise the price only a small amount before the reductions in quantity demanded would reduce profits. So when demand was elastic, the monopolist could raise price only a little bit profitably. When demand is inelastic, the monopolist can raise the price a lot more. So this means if the monopolist can identify two different groups, one with a high elasticity, one with a low elasticity, the monopolist would want to raise the price different amounts for the different groups. Raise it only a little bit for the group with a high elasticity, raise it more for the group with a low elasticity of demand. Okay, so if the monopolist, let's see again, if a firm can set the price and it knows different groups have different elasticities and the monopolist can identify who these groups are, has an easy way of knowing who belongs to which group, and finally, if there's limited resale of the good, then it's profitable for the monopolist or any firm that can set price to set different prices for the different groups of people. Now, let me go back to a couple of these things. Again, this applies only to price setters. Obviously, not for a competitive firm. Competitive firms can't set their prices, so would not be able to price discriminate. Price discrimination is a feature of markets where firms set prices. Price discrimination is a feature of markets where firms are price setters. Okay. Second, the whole reason that firms want to do this is because different groups of consumers behave differently. The firm needs to be able to identify who belongs to each group. So it has to have some way of doing that, obviously, in order to link the price to that characteristic. And the final important thing is there needs to be limited resale of the good. If this is something that one person, well, if the monopolist is selling the same good to different groups at different prices, and people are able to resell the good, then the people who are offered a low price will buy it, turn around, sell it to the people who are being offered a higher price. Okay, so when these conditions are met, there's an opportunity to increase profits by charging different prices to different groups, and charging a lower price to groups who are more sensitive to price increases. One example of price discrimination might be a movie theater or museum or restaurant charging a discount or offering a discount to students or senior citizens. The logic behind this is that the business has an option of either charging one price to everyone or it charges different prices to the, let's say, cheap people versus the people who are not so cheap. By cheap, I mean sensitive to price. And it might be that students and retirees are more sensitive to price because they have limited budgets. That's entirely logical. So in that case, instead of trying to set one price that will be too high for senior citizens and students to afford it, but at the same time too low to maximize profits from the normal people, instead of trying to do one price that instead of setting one price that doesn't quite do things optimally for either group, the business might want to instead set a price that maximizes profits among the cheap people and a different price that maximizes profits among the normal people. That's the idea of price discrimination. These examples of like a movie ticket, like how do businesses do the important things like identifying groups? Well, the business can ask the students to show an ID. Same thing for senior citizens, demonstrate their age. Limited resale is another important thing because imagine the student could purchase a ticket at the discounted price and then walk out in front of the movie theater and then resell it to some other customer at just a little bit below the normal price. That would hypothetically be profitable for the student who resells the ticket at a higher price than they paid, and beneficial for the customer who's able to get a student ticket instead of paying full price. If there is the ability to resell the tickets, then price discrimination doesn't work very well. All right, so I brought up discounts to senior citizens, students, as an example of price discrimination. Another example of price discrimination might be in the complicated way that airline tickets are priced. In a logical world, a plane ticket from place A to place B at a certain time of day on a particular day of the week would always cost the same amount. But airlines do these silly things like the price of the ticket depends on how far in advance you purchase the ticket, or the price of the ticket depends on whether there's a Saturday night stay involved in the trip. Like before you return home, do you spend a Saturday night in the other city? Airlines do this because they're trying to identify different groups with different willingnesses to pay for tickets. In particular, they're trying to separate out like leisure travelers, people who are just vacationing for fun, from business travelers. And probably the leisure travelers are more sensitive to prices. Heck, I'm more sensitive to prices when I'm spending my own money than when I'm spending my employer's money. That much is simple. Like, there is a very simple logical reason why business travelers are less sensitive to prices. If that's true, the optimal pricing strategy would involve charging a higher price to business travelers than to vacation travelers or leisure travelers. Back in the olden days, there would be different parts of the airplane that were labeled different ways, like business class versus tourist class. Then I guess the businesses caught on that they could tell their employees always fly in the tourist class. Don't fly business class. So business class has become kind of a luxury, and most business people do in fact travel in the standard class. Okay, so that attempt at price discrimination didn't work forever. Instead, airlines try to do complicated things where tickets are priced depending on things that business people are more likely to do. Business people are less likely to plan a trip 2 months in advance than vacation travelers. Vacations, we plan those in advance. We're willing to buy tickets far in advance. Business people, a trip might come up or an issue might come up at work and they need to travel over the next few days or next week. So business travelers tend to buy their tickets very short time in advance. This is why ticket prices tend to go up closer to the date of travel. Airlines know those people buying tickets during the last days are likely to be business travelers and likely to have a high willingness to pay for a plane ticket. Another feature of these complicated pricing structures are that people usually pay a lower price for a round trip ticket if they stay over a Saturday night in the destination city. In other words, if you fly from A to B, fly out on Monday, fly back on Saturday, the ticket will cost more than if you fly out on Monday and return on Sunday. Why the difference? Well, airlines have figured out that business travelers tend to want to be home for the weekend. They don't want to spend the whole weekend in a different city. They'd like to be back home with their families. So they'd like to return on Friday or maybe Saturday morning. But if they stay over Saturday night, that means that they don't see their family over the weekend. Again, it's the kind of thing that business travelers don't want to do, whereas vacationers tend to want to spend the whole weekend in their destination city and return late on Sunday or on Monday. So these different patterns of travel help identify different groups who have different spending patterns. And therefore, the airlines try to charge them different prices. Okay, so this is all called price discrimination, and monopolists and any other firm that can set the price will attempt to set different prices for different groups of people. All right, so at this point, I'm done with this lecture on monopoly. I do want to stress that price discrimination is a feature of markets where firms are price setters. And in this course, that mainly means firms that are monopolists. Okay, I'm over, I'm done, the end.